In the ruthless, violently structured world of lycanthropy, an omega is meant to be completely invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of pack society, seen only when ordered and heard only when spoken to. But Mave Gallagher had a glaring problem. She couldn't hide 3 feral orphaned pups who shadowed her every single move. They slept curled at her bruised feet, snarled at any superior who raised a hand to her, and refused to be pried from her side. For months, the Crescent Ridge Pack whispered that the lowly Omega had used dark, forbidden magic to bind the children to her. They were entirely wrong. The truth was far more dangerous. And when Alpha King Dominic Hayes finally stepped foot on their territory and caught the children's scent, it unraveled a blood-soaked conspiracy that brought the entire werewolf hierarchy to its trembling knees. The Crescent Ridge Pack operated out of the sprawling, heavily fortified estate, nestled deep within the damp evergreen forests of Oregon. To the human world, they were the board members and blue-collar workers of Crescent Timber and Logistics, a multi-million-dollar logging empire. To the supernatural world, they were a brutal traditionalist pack ruled by Alpha Alistair Reed, a man who ran his territory with an iron fist and a profound disdain for weakness. At the absolute bottom of Alistair's hierarchy was Mave Gallagher. 22 years old, petite, and perpetually exhausted, Mave was an Omega who bore the brunt of the pack's daily frustrations. Her parents had been low-ranking border patrols who died in a skirmish when she was just a teenager, leaving her with no dowry, no protection, and no standing. In a pack that valued sheer aggression and corporate ruthlessness, Mave was reduced to a glorified scullery maid. Her days were spent scrubbing the vast slate floors of the pack house, laundering the blood-stained clothing of the enforcers, and keeping her head bowed to avoid the cruel taunts of high-ranking females like Sienna Croft, the lead enforcer's mate. But Mave's solitary, miserable existence had violently shifted 3 months ago on a freezing November morning. A border patrol had returned from the northern ridge, dragging 3 shivering mud-caked pups. They were tiny, malnourished, and wry of ash and rogue scent. The oldest, Toby, was barely 7. The middle girl, Maya, was 5th, clutching a torn piece of flannel. The youngest, Leo, was a toddler of no more than 3, too weak to even cry. Alpha Alistair had taken one look at the shivering trio, deemed them useless rogue offspring, and ordered them to be tossed into the outdoor kennels to freeze or toughen up. Mave hadn't planned on becoming a savior. She knew the consequences of defying the Alpha. But that night, listening to the agonizing reedy whimpers echoing from the freezing kennels, something deep within her Omega nature snapped. She had slipped out in the dead of night, picked the rusty lock, and smuggled the 3 pups into her tiny windowless boiler room in the basement. She bathed them in a utility sink. She fed them stolen scraps of roasted elk from the Alpha's table. And from that night onward, a strange, unbreakable bond was forged. The pack discovered them a few days later, but something bizarre had happened. The pups, previously terrified and catatonic, transformed into vicious little gargoyles whenever anyone approached Mave. When Sienna Croft had cornered Mave in the laundry room, raising a hand to strike the Omega for a missing towel, 7-year-old Toby had lunged his tiny jaws, snapping shut on Sienna's ankle with enough force to draw blood. When the enforcers tried to drag the children away to discipline them, little Mia let out a localized high-pitched sonic howl that shattered the glass of the kitchen windows, while baby Leo clung to the back of Mave's neck, burying his face in her scent gland. It was an anomaly. Pups were meant to respect the pack hierarchy, bowing to alphas and betas. These 3 bowed to no one but the lowest-ranking Omega. They followed her everywhere in a tight protective triangle. If Mave was scrubbing the grand staircase, Toby sat on the landing above his golden eyes, scanning the hallway for threats, while Mia sat on the step below, playing with the soapy water. Leo simply remained strapped to Mave's back in a makeshift sling she had fashioned from a bedsheet. It's unnatural. Beta Harrison Lockett had sneered one evening watching the odd procession make its way across the courtyard. She's cursed them, or they're defective. No right-minded wolf pup imprints on a floor scrubber. Alpha Alistair had allowed it to continue only because it amused him and because tearing the feral children away from the Omega resulted in ear-separating wails that gave him a migraine. Let the Omega play mother to the rogue trash, Alistair had decreed. They fit perfectly together at the bottom of the barrel. But Mave knew it wasn't a curse. It was something physical. Whenever the pups strayed more than a few feet from her, they began to visibly shake. Their skin would flush with a dangerous, unnatural heat, and their veins would darken beneath their pale skin. It was as if being near Mave, inhaling her specific sweet cedar and vanilla omega scent, was the only thing keeping them tethered to life. She didn't understand the biology of it, but she knew her scent was acting as a balm, perhaps even an antidote to whatever trauma they had endured. She loved them fiercely. They were her shadows, her secret family in a house of monsters. But the fragile piece of their hidden existence was about to be shattered by an event that threw the entire Crescent Ridge estate into a blind panic. The Alpha King was coming. Dominic Hayes was not just a king. He was a walking natural disaster wrapped in bespoke Italian suits. As the CEO of Hayes Global, he controlled a massive portion of the North American supernatural economy. As the Alpha King, his authority was absolute, carved out over a decade of brutal warfare against rogue factions and traitorous pack leaders. He was a man of terrifying power, known for his cold, calculating demeanor and his complete lack of mercy for those who broke the ancient laws. Rumors preceded his arrival like a dark storm front. Word on the pack grapevine was that Dominic was conducting a sweeping audit of the West Coast territories. 6 months prior, his younger sister, Princess Penelope, and her mate had been assassinated in a highly coordinated ambush near the Canadian border. The killers had burned the royal convoy to the ground, leaving no remains. Since then, Dominic had been a wolf-possessed, tearing through the country, hunting for the masterminds behind the treason. When the royal convoy of sleek, black SUVs rolled up the gravel driveway of Crescent Timber and Logistics' main estate, the air pressure in the valley seemed to drop. Inside the packhouse, absolute chaos reigned. Alpha Alistair was sweating through his collar, barking orders at the boss and enforcers to ensure the financial ledgers were pristine and the grounds were flawless. The strict directive had been given all Omega's runs, and undesirables were to remain confined to the basement or the outer cabins. Alistair wanted Dominic to see a pack of strong, wealthy, and disciplined warriors, not a charity house. Keep those feral brats locked in the boiler room, Gallagher. Beta Harrison Leck had snarled at Mave, roughly shoving her shoulder as he marched past the kitchen. If the king sees a single hair of those filthy runts, I will personally skin them, and you can watch. Do you understand me? Mave had nodded submissively, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hurried down to the basement, ushering Toby, Mia, and Leo into the small, warm room housing the estate's water heaters. She locked the heavy iron door from the inside, gathering the 3 children onto a pile of old blankets. "Shh, my sweet shadows," Mave whispered, kissing Leo's forehead as the toddler whimpered, sensing the suffocating oppressive aura of the Alpha King bleeding through the very foundation of the house. "We just have to stay quiet just for tonight." But the sheer gravity of Dominic Hayes' presence was overwhelming. Upstairs, the grand doors opened. Even buried in the basement, Mave could feel the kinetic shockwave of his aura. It was a dense, crushing weight of ozone-dark pine and raw, undisputed dominance. Toby's eyes immediately flashed a bright, piercing amber, and he let out a low, involuntary growl, his tiny chest rumbling. "Clear his throat! Toby, no!" Mave hushed, pulling him into her chest. She released as much of her calming pheromones as she could, flooding the small room with the scent of cedar and vanilla. It usually worked, but today the children were agitated beyond control. The veins in Mia's neck began to darken, the strange, sickly flush returning to her cheeks. Upstairs, the royal banquet was underway. Dominic sat at the head of the massive oak dining table, flanked by his towering royal guards. His sharp ice-blue eyes scanned the room. Missing nothing, he listened to Alistair boast about the pack's timber yields and territorial expansion. But Dominic's expression remained utterly bored, bordering on lethal. He wasn't here for timber. He was here looking for ghosts. "Your ledgers are adequate, Alistair." Dominic finally spoke his voice, a low, growly baritone that silenced the clinking of silver on china. "But your border security is lax. I noted 3 blind spots on the eastern ridge where a regiment could pass undetected." Alistair paused, dabbing his forehead with a napkin. My king, I assure you those ridges are patrolled daily. Do not assure me of lies. Dominic cut in smoothly, taking a sip of his wine. Down in the basement, disaster struck. The main water line, strained by the massive influx of guests using the estate's facilities, violently ruptured. A pipe directly above the boiler room burst, sending a torrent of scalding hot water crashing through the ceiling panels. Mave screamed as the boiling water splashed against her arm. She grabbed Leo, sheltering his small body, while Toby and Mia scrambled back. The room was flooding within seconds, the water rising rapidly, thick with steam and rust. They couldn't stay. They would be boiled alive or drown. Panicking Mave kicked open the heavy iron door, ushering the coughing, soaking wet pups out into the basement corridor. She needed to get them to the servants' quarters out the back door, but the back exit was locked from the outside, a security measure taken by Harrison Lockhart to ensure no staff sneaked out during the king's visit. Trapped with the water rising and the pups coughing on the thick steam, Mave had only one choice. She had to go up the service stairs. She had to cross the back edge of the great hall to reach the kitchen exit. "Keep your heads down," she whispered frantically, wrapping her dry apron around a shivering Leo. "Do not make a sound." She pushed open the service door at the top of the stairs. The banquet was in full swing, the room filled with the booming voices of the Crescent Ridge elite. Mave hugged the shadows of the tapestries, pressing herself against the stone wall, praying to the moon goddess that they would remain unnoticed. But Toby was a protector. As they skirted the edge of the dining hall, a drunken enforcer stumbled backward from the table, his heavy boot coming down hard on Mia's bare foot. Mia let out a sharp, pained yelp. Instantly, the drunken enforcer turned, smearing. "What the hell? I thought Alpha said to lock up the garbage." He raised a heavy hand to backhand the little girl. He never made contact, with a feral, terrifying screech that sounded too large for his small body. 7-year-old Toby launched himself through the air. He bypassed the enforcer entirely and landed squarely on the polished wood of the royal dining table, shattering crystal glasses and sending plates flying. The entire hall froze. Dead, horrifying silence descended upon the room. Toby, dripping wet, covered in soot, and trembling with rage, stood on the center of the table. He wasn't looking at the enforcer. He was looking directly at the head of the table, directly at Alpha King Dominic Heirs. And then the impossible happened. The tiny 7-year-old orphan bared his teeth and let out a vicious, challenging roar right in the face of the king. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Alistair Reed's face drained of all color, matching the stark white of the fine linen tablecloth. To challenge an Alpha King, even as a pup, was an act of high treason, punishable by immediate execution. "Clear his throat! Guards!" Alistair shrieked, his voice cracking in terror. "Kill the robed brat! Get it off the table!" 2 massive enforcers surged forward. But before they could lay a finger on the boy, a frantic blur of motion intercepted them. Mave threw herself between the guards and the table, shielding Toby with her own body while clutching Leo to her chest. Mia clung to Mave's leg, crying out in distress. "Please," Mave begged, dropping to her knees on the shattered glass, bowing her head so low it pressed against the wet floorboards. "Please, Alpha, have mercy. He's just a child. He doesn't know what he's doing. But Thing, take my life, punish me, but please spare them." "You stupid, worthless beta," Harrison roared, stepping forward, his claws extending from his fingertips. "You have doomed us all. I'll rip your throat out myself." Harrison lunged, aiming a lethal strike at Maeve's exposed neck. Mave squeezed her eyes shut, wrapping her arms tightly around her pups, bracing for the agonizing sting of death. It never came. Clear's throat, a deafening concussive boom echoed through the hall, followed by the sickening sound of breaking bones. Mave opened her eyes to see Harrison Lockhart flying backward through the air, as if hit by a freight train. He crashed into a stone pillar 30 feet away, sliding to the floor in an unconscious broken heap. Standing over Mave, radiating an aura so violently oppressive that half the room was forced onto their knees, was Dominic Heirs. His eyes were blazing a terrifying luminescent silver. The royal guard had weapons drawn, but Dominic raised a single gloved hand, halting them instantly. The Alpha King slowly lowered his gaze to the soaking, wet trembling Omega on the floor, and the three fiercely protective pups clustered around her. Toby was still growling, though his small legs were shaking under the pressure of the king's aura. Dominic didn't strike the boy. Instead, he tilted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. A profound, terrifying stillness overtook the king. The rage that had been boiling beneath his skin suddenly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass. Alistair whimpered from the sidelines. "My king, I apologize for this insult. They are rogue filth. We found them in the woods." Silence. Dominic's voice wasn't a yell. It was a quiet, lethal command that instantly sealed Alistair's throat. Dominic crouched down until he was eye level with Mave. She was shaking violently, the scent of her fear, sharp and pungent. But beneath the fear, beneath the smell of damp clothes and rusty water, Dominic was inhaling something else. He looked at Toby. He looked past the grime, the matted hair, and the malnutrition. He stared into the boy's eyes. They weren't golden as they appeared in the dim light. Up close, catching the reflection of the chandeliers, they were a distinct, crystalline silver, a genetic trait exclusive to the Heirs royal bloodline. Dominic's breath hitched. He reached out a trembling hand toward little Mia, who flinched, burying her face into Maeve's shoulder. Dominic gently touched the ragged piece of flannel the little girl was clutching. It wasn't flannel. It was a torn, burnt shred of a royal guard's cloak. "Where did you get these children?" Dominic whispered the question directed at Mave, his voice thick with an emotion the ruthless king had not shown in months. I didn't," Mave stammered, tears mixing with the dirty water on her face. "The border patrols found them. They were going to let them die in the cold. I just kept them warm. Please, my king, they are good pups. They need you." Dominic finished, his eyes snapping to the dark veins spiderwebbing beneath Mia's skin. He recognized the symptom instantly. Nightshade wolfsbane, a slow-acting, incredibly rare poison designed to suppress royal traits and slowly kill the host over months. And then the final puzzle piece clicked into place for the Alpha King. He leaned in, burying his face near Maeve's neck, inhaling deeply. The entire pack gasped at the intimate gesture. But Dominic wasn't claiming her. He was diagnosing a miracle. Maeve's unique omega scent, the cedar and vanilla, was incredibly potent, laced with a rare natural enzyme found only in a handful of omegas every century. Her proximity, her constant physical contact with the pups, was acting as a continuous biological dialysis. She wasn't just comforting them. She was keeping the poison from reaching their hearts. She had been unknowingly keeping his dead sister's children alive for 3 months. Dominic stood up slowly. The shock in his eyes hardened into something so dark, so terrifyingly violent, that the chandeliers above began to rattle from the sheer force of his suppressed power. These weren't rogue runs. This was Prince Tobias, Princess Amelia, and Prince Leonidas, the lost heirs to the Eastern Territory. And they had been found on Alistair Reed's land, suffering from a poison that only high-ranking nobles had access to. Dominic slowly turned his head to look at Alpha Alistair Reed, the Crescent Ridge. Alpha was now trembling uncontrollably, the realization of his fatal mistake dawning on him as he looked at the children, then at the king's silver eyes. Alistair, Dominic said, his voice echoing like a death knell in the cavernous hall. "You told me your ledgers were clean. You told me you had no knowledge of my sister's murder near your borders. My king, I swear upon the goddess I did not know who they were," Alistair cried out, dropping to his knees. "They were covered in ash. They didn't smell like royalty because the poison masked their scent," Dominic said coldly, taking a slow step toward the Alpha. "A poison someone administered before dropping them in the woods to die a slow, deniable death. Someone operating within your territory." Dominic looked back at Mave, who was staring up at him in wide-eyed confusion, clutching the royal heirs tightly to her chest. "You," Dominic pointed a sharp finger at Mave, his tone shifting from wrathful to a fiercely protective command. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not let them go." He turned back to the trembling pack leaders, his royal guards, unsheathing their silver blades in unison. The doors of the great hall slammed shut, with a magical, resounding thud, locked from the inside by the king's own power. Tonight, Alpha King Dominic Hayes announced a cruel, predatory smile, curving his lips as he cracked his knuckles. The audit is no longer about timber. No one leaves this room until I find out exactly whose hands are stained with my sister's blood. The heavy oak doors of the grand dining hall shuddered as Captain Gideon crossed the Alpha King's towering lead guard, slid a solid iron crossbar into place. The resounding clank echoed through the cavernous space, sealing the Crescent Ridge elite inside with their worst nightmare. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted, the air growing thick and suffocating under the sheer unadulterated weight of Dominic Hayes's killing intent. Alpha Alastair Reed remained on his knees, his tailored suit soaking up the puddle of rusty boiler water that had trailed in from the hallway. "My king," Alastair wheezed, clutching his chest as the atmospheric pressure squeezed his lungs. "I swear on my ancestors, I knew nothing of a plot against Princess Penelope. We are a logging pack. We deal in timber and freight, not royal assassinations." "Timber and freight," Dominic repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He didn't look at Alastair. His icy blue eyes were entirely focused on the shivering pile of bodies on the floor. Mave Gallagher was still huddled on the shattered glass. Her small frame curled protectively over the three royal heirs. Toby, Prince Tobias, was still baring his tiny teeth, though his silver eyes were wide with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had spiked his royal wolf was fading, and the insidious nightshade, Wolfsbane, was rushing to fill the void. The dark, sickly veins on Maya's neck pulsed angrily, and the little girl let out a weak, rattling cough. Dominic's jaw tightened. He unbuttoned his bespoke charcoal-gray suit jacket, a garment worth more than the entire Crescent Ridge pack, and stripped it off. To the absolute shock of the watching nobles, the Alpha King knelt onto the wet, glass-strewn floor. He gently draped the heavy silk-lined jacket over Mave and the pups, enveloping them in his own potent cedar and ozone scent. "Captain Cross," Dominic commanded without turning his head. "Yes, Your Majesty," Gideon replied, stepping forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his silver-forged tactical blade. "Contact Dr. Arthur Pendleton at the Seattle estate. Tell him I need a pediatric toxicology team airborne in 5 minutes. We have 3 cases of advanced nightshade wolfsbane poisoning. They will need immediate blood transfusions and marrow stabilizers." Dominic looked directly at Mave, his voice softening just a fraction. "And tell them to prepare a trauma suite for a female Omega. She has chemical burns." Mave blinked, looking down at her arm, where the scalding boiler water had blistered her skin. Clear as throat. She hadn't even felt it. I'm fine," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just help them, please, my king." Dominic's eyes traced the elegant bruised curve of her jawline. In a society that worshipped power and status, this battered, nameless Omega had shown more courage and loyalty in 5 minutes than his entire royal court had shown in 5 years. "You have done your duty, little wolf," Dominic murmured, a strange, undeniable pull igniting in his chest as he inhaled her calming vanilla and cedar scent. "Now I will do mine." He stood up, towering over the room once more, the brief moment of gentleness vanishing beneath the terrifying visage of the Alpha King. He turned his attention to the crowd of terrified socialites, enforcers, and board members. "Nightshade wolfsbane is not a weed you accidentally forage in the Oregon pines." Dominic addressed the room, pacing slowly like a caged predator. "It is a highly regulated black market botanical native to the deep Amazon. It costs upwards of $50,000 an ounce. To acquire enough to steadily dose 3 royal pups for months without killing them outright requires a precision operation. It requires a steady supply chain. It requires deep pockets." Dominic stopped pacing and stared down at Alastair. "You claim you are just a logging company, Alastair. Yet my sister's convoy was ambushed on Route 9, less than 20 miles from your primary freight depot. A month later, 3 road pups miraculously appear on your borders, heavily drugged, smelling of ash, and your pack just happened to toss them into a freezing kennel to let nature take its course, leaving no bloody hands." Alastair was shaking his head frantically. "The patrols. The patrols found them. I didn't question it. We have rogues crossing the Canadian border all the time. Who was the patrol captain on duty that night?" Gideon Cross barked, stepping forward. "Silence," hung heavy over the room. No one dared to speak. "I will ask once more," Dominic said, his silver eyes glowing with lethal promise. "Who found the pups?" From the back of the room, a sharp, manicured hand pointed toward the stone pillar. It was Beatrice Caldwell, the pack's chief financial officer. She was trembling, clutching her tablet to her chest. It was Beta Harrison, Your Majesty." Harrison Lockhart and his lead enforcers. Dominic's gaze shifted to the unconscious form of Harrison Lockhart, slumped against the pillar where Dominic had thrown him. Standing near Harrison, her face as pale as a corpse, was his mate, Sienna Croft. Sienna took a step back, her hands raised. "Beatrice is lying. She's just trying to save her own skin because her ledgers are a mess." "Are they?" Dominic snapped his fingers. Gideon crossed the room in 3 massive strides, snatching the tablet from Beatrice Caldwell's trembling hands. He tapped the screen rapidly, bypassing the encrypted firewalls of Crescent Timber and Logistics with a royal override code. The room waited in agonizing suspense as Gideon's eyes scanned the digital spreadsheets. "Your Majesty," Gideon's voice was grim. "Looking at the Q3 logistics manifests, there's a recurring unlisted expenditure hidden under heavy machinery maintenance. 3 separate wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account is registered to a shell corporation." Gideon paused, looking up, his eyes locking onto Sienna Croft. "A corporation named Croft Holdings." A collective gasp echoed through the dining hall. Furthermore, Gideon continued reading the data. "There is a shipping manifest for a specialized climate-controlled biocontainer that arrived at the Crescent Ridge Freight Depot exactly 3 days before Princess Penelope's convoy was attacked. Signed for by Harrison Lockhart." The trap had snapped shut. The corporate espionage and the ancient bloody laws of the Lionthrope world had violently collided. Dominic walked slowly toward Sienna. The crowd partied like the Red Sea, desperate to put distance between themselves and the king's wrath. "You bought the poison," Dominic stated a terrifyingly calm fact. "You facilitated the ambush, and when the assassins realized my sister had hidden the pups in the woods before she was slaughtered, your mate was tasked with hunting them down." "No!" Sienna shrieked, tears running her designer makeup. "We didn't know they were royals. We were just paid to dispose of some rogue kids. A contractor reached out to Harrison, offered us $5 million to make them disappear." "Who was the contractor?" Dominic demanded, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating the glass in the window panes. Before Sienna could answer, a guttural, furious roar shattered the interrogation. Harrison Lockhart had regained consciousness. The beater, nursing a shattered collarbone and a bleeding skull, realized the depth of his exposure the moment he heard his mate confessing. He knew the punishment for high treason against the crown. It wasn't just execution. It was the systematic eradication of his entire bloodline. Clear as throat, he had nothing left to lose. With the desperate, blinding speed of a cornered wolf, Harrison lunged. He didn't go for Dominic, knowing it would be instant death. He didn't go for Gideon. He went for the weakest link in the room. Clear as throat. He went for the prize that was currently keeping the heirs alive. He lunged straight for Mave. "If I die, the royal brats die with me." Harrison roared, his claws fully extended, aiming to rip Mave away from the pups and use her as a human shield. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. The royal guards drew their weapons, but Harrison was too close. Toby let out a tiny, ferocious snap in front of Mave, but his legs gave out from the poison. Mave didn't scream. Clear as throat. Decades of abuse at the hands of Alistair's pack had taught her one thing. Survival meant taking the hit. She twisted her body, throwing herself entirely over Leo and Mia, exposing her back to Harrison's incoming claws. She closed her eyes, waiting for the fatal strike. But the strike never landed. The sound of flesh tearing and bones snapping echoed through the grand hall, accompanied by a sickening, wet thud. Mave flinched, but she felt no pain. Warm blood splattered against her cheek, but it wasn't her own. Slowly, she opened her eyes and looked up. Dominic Hayes stood directly in front of her. His right hand was buried deep in Harrison Locke's chest. The beta was suspended in the air, his eyes wide with shock, blood bubbling from his lips. Dominic had moved faster than the human eye could track, intercepting the beta's leap with lethal absolute precision. "You do not touch what is mine," Dominic whispered. A demonic dual-toned growl layered beneath his human voice. With a brutal, effortless yank, Dominic withdrew his hand. Harrison Lockhart collapsed to the floor, dead before his body even hit the polished wood. Sienna Croft let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing to her knees as her mate bond severed, tearing her mind apart. Several of the Crescent Ridge elite turned away, vomiting from the sheer brutality and the overwhelming scent of royal dominance that now saturated the room. Dominic pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket, calmly wiping the blood from his hand. He didn't spare a second glance at the dead traitor. He turned his attention back to the weeping, broken widow on the floor. "Captain Cross," Dominic said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Arrest Sienna Croft. Lock her in the royal dungeon at the Seattle estate. She will be interrogated by the Inquisitors until she gives up the name of the contractor who paid them. Then she will be executed." "Yes, Your Majesty," Gideon replied, signaling 2 guards who immediately dragged the screaming Sienna out of the hall. Dominic then turned to Alpha Alistair Reed, who was weeping openly, his face pressed against the wet floor. "Alistair Reed," Dominic declared, his voice booming across the silent, terrified room. "Through your gross negligence, incompetence, and failure to monitor your own pack's financial ledgers, you allowed a treasonous cell to operate on your land. You allowed my sister to be murdered, and you allowed my nephew and nieces to be tortured in your own backyard. Mercy, Alpha King, I beg of you," Alistair sobbed. "Take my lands, take my company. To spare my life, I am taking everything," Dominic stated coldly. "As of this second, the Crescent Ridge Pack is dissolved. Your assets, your logging contracts, and your territories are now the property of the Crown. You are stripped of your Alpha title. You and your board members will be taken to the northern labor camps to serve out the rest of your pathetic lives. The courage to start is the first start. The courage to start is the first step to seed. The courage to start." But Dominic silenced them instantly. The royal guards moved in, securing the former Alpha and his betas with silver-lined cuffs. The immediate threat neutralized, the oppressive, terrifying aura in the room slowly began to dissipate. Dominic took a deep breath, fighting to push his roaring, bloodthirsty wolf back beneath the surface. He needed to be calm. He needed to be safe. He turned back to the pile of shattered glass. Mave was still on the floor, trembling violently, covered in Dominic's suit jacket. She was clutching the 3 royal children so tightly her knuckles were white. Toby had passed out from exhaustion, his head resting on her collarbone. Mia was quietly crying into her apron, and little Leo was gripping her hair with his tiny fists. Dominic crouched down beside her. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently resting his large, warm hand on the back of Maeve Clear's throat hair. "It's over," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the monster who had just ripped a man's heart out. "You are safe now." "They are safe." Mayhab looked up at him, her large, doe-like eyes filled with a mixture of terror, awe, and an exhaustion so deep it resonated in her bones. "They need a doctor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The dark veins. They're spreading again." Dominic looked at his niece's neck. The poison was indeed advancing, spurred on by the stress of the attack. Dr. Pendleton's helicopter was still minutes away, and every second counted. "I know," Dominic said. He carefully scooped Maeve up into his arms, refusing to separate her from the children clinging to her. She gasped, expecting to be dropped or reprimanded for touching the king. But Dominic held her securely against his broad chest. Despite the blood on his shirt, he smelled like safety. He smelled like home. "Captain," Dominic called out over his shoulder as he carried the Omega and his family toward the grand exit. "Secure the perimeter. Have the medical chopper land directly on the front lawn and prepare my private jet." "Where to, Your Majesty?" Gideon asked, following closely behind. Dominic looked down at the bruised, beautiful Omega in his arms, a scent of vanilla and cedar wrapping around his heart like an iron band. For 3 months, this nameless outcast had loved his family when the world had left them to die. She had taken their pain, borne their burdens, and offered her life for theirs without a second thought. "We are going back to the capital," Dominic stated, stepping out into the cool, dark Oregon night, "and we are taking their mother with us." The royal helicopter bypassed the dense, rainy canopy of the Oregon forests, cutting a direct path north toward Washington state. Their destination was the Heirs Global Sovereign Estate, a sprawling, ultra-secure compound nestled on the shores of Lake Washington in Medina. To the human billionaires who shared the affluent zip code, the Hay property was merely the reclusive stronghold of an eccentric tech and logistics magnate. To the supernatural world, it was the impenetrable fortress of the Alpha King. Inside the estate's underground medical wing, a state-of-the-art facility rivaling the trauma centers at Virginia, Mason Medical Center Absolute Chaos had been distilled into cold clinical precision. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the royal physician and a leading expert in lyanthropic toxicology, had his team moving at a blinding pace. The 3 royal pups lay on stainless steel examination tables beneath glaring surgical lights. Intravenous lines were threaded into their small arms, pumping an aggressive flush of lipid emulsions and activated charcoal into their bloodstreams to combat the Aenitum napellus, the active lethal compound in nightshade wolfsbane. Mave Gallagher sat on a sterile white cot in the corner, a stark contrast to her previous life in the damp boiler room. She had been scrubbed clean by the royal nursing staff, her chemical burns treated with a soothing advanced cellular regeneration salve and dressed in soft cashmere scrubs. Yet despite the luxury and the safety, she was trembling, her eyes locked onto the heart monitors, beeping erratically across the room. Dominic Hayes stood near the reinforced glass doors, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the sterile room. He had washed the blood from his hands and changed into a clean, dark Henley, but the lethal tension humming beneath his skin hadn't dissipated. His silver eyes flicked constantly between his dying family and the small, terrified Omega who had kept them alive. "Your Majesty," Dr. Pendleton said, his voice grave as he approached the king, stripping off his latex gloves. "The lipid therapy is barely holding the toxin at bay. The wolf's bane has embedded itself deeply into their bone marrow. Because they are royals, their immune systems are fighting back, but the poison is designed to suppress their accelerated healing. We are losing Princess Mia. Her heart rate is dropping precipitously." Dominic's jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Fix it, Arthur. I do not care what it costs. Synthesize a cure. It isn't a matter of money, sire." The doctor sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "The only known neutralizing agent for this specific Amazonian strain is the first spec to succeed. Biological enzyme. Clears throat. It's an antibody that occurs naturally in perhaps 1 in a million wolves." Pendleton paused, turning his gaze toward the corner of the room where Mave sat, her hands twisted anxiously in her lap. "An enzyme that miraculously Miss Gallagher possesses in absolute abundance. It is why her scent alone was acting as a topical dialysis for the children." Dominic's head snapped toward the doctor. "Are you saying her blood is the cure?" "Yes," Pendleton confirmed. "But to synthesize enough serum for all 3 children, we would need to draw a dangerous amount of her blood. Given her severe malnourishment and the trauma she has already endured at Crescent Ridge, extracting that volume could send her into hypoalmic shock. It could kill her." Before Dominic could respond, a small, determined voice echoed across the medical bay. "Take it." Dominic and Doctor. Pendleton turned. Mave had stood up from the cot. She was pale, her small frame looking incredibly fragile beneath the glaring hospital lights, but her eyes were devoid of fear. She walked toward the surgical tables, gently brushing a lock of sweaty hair from little Mia's forehead. "Take whatever you need," Mave said, looking directly at Doctor Pendleton. "Drain me dry if you have to. Just save them." "Mave," Dominic said, stepping forward, his voice a low, rumbling command that surprised him with its gentleness. He hadn't realized he had learned her name from the pack registry Gideon had pulled. "You do not have to do this. You have sacrificed enough. You are under the protection of the crown now. I will not order you to give your life." Mave turned to look at the Alpha King. The terrifying monarch who had ripped a man's heart out just hours ago was looking at her with an expression of profound protective intensity. But Mave didn't bow. She didn't cower. For the first time in her life, she stood her ground. "We don't have to order me, Your Majesty," she said quietly, her voice steady. "They are your blood, but they are my heart. They are the only family I have ever known. Please." A heavy silence fell over the room. Dominic stared into her eyes, feeling the ancient dormant instincts of his royal wolf rise to the surface. Not with a demand for dominance, but with a fierce, overwhelming urge to claim, to protect, to cherish. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in their society. Yet, she possessed the soul of a warrior queen. Dominic gave a stiff, single nod to the doctor. "Do it safely, Arthur. If she flatlines, I will hold you personally responsible." As the medical team prepped Mave for the central line extraction, the heavy, reinforced doors of the medical wing hissed open. Captain Gideon Cross stepped inside his tactical uniform, smelling faintly of ozone and jet fuel. His expression was grim. "Claire's throat, sire," Gideon murmured, pulling Dominic out into the soundproofed hallway. "The Inquisitors broke, Sienna Croft," and Dominic asked, his silver eyes flashing with deadly anticipation. "The contractor who paid Crescent Ridge wasn't a rival cartel or a rogue faction," Gideon revealed, handing a heavily encrypted tablet to the king. "It was an inside job. The offshore accounts trace back to a shell corporation managed by Vanguard Global Shipping." Dominic stared at the tablet, the blood turning to ice in his veins. Vanguard Global was the largest maritime logistics company on the West Coast, and its CEO was Lord Alaric Preston, the head of the North American Lycan Council. Dominic's most trusted advisor and a man who had stood beside Dominic at Princess Penelope's funeral. Preston, Dominic breathed the betrayal burning like acid in his chest. Why, Princess Penelope was conducting an audit of the western ports before her death, Gideon explained quietly. "We found deleted files on Vanguard servers. Preston has been using his shipping lanes to smuggle illegal wolfsbane and weapons into the territory." Penelope found out. She was going to expose him to the council, so he had her convoy ambushed and paid off Alistair Reed's men to dispose of the surviving heirs, to tie up the loose ends. Dominic handed the tablet back to Gideon. The king's aura didn't explode into violence this time. Instead, it condensed into a suffocating absolute zero chill. It was the calm before a catastrophic storm. "Where is Lord Preston now?" Dominic asked. "He's here, Your Majesty," Gideon replied, unholstering his weapon. "He arrived at the Medina estate 10 minutes ago under the guise of an emergency council meeting to discuss the rogue attack at Crescent Ridge, but he brought his private security detail. 30 heavily armed mercenaries. They are sweeping the upper floors. He knows Sienna was captured. He's here to finish the job and kill the heirs before they can testify." The distinct suppressed pop of gunfire echoed faintly through the ventilation shafts of the subterranean medical bay. Dominic didn't hesitate. "Lock down this wing," he ordered Gideon. "No one gets in." Inside the trauma room, alarms were blaring. Mave was lying on a cot beside the pups, a thick tube drawing her antibody-rich blood directly into a centrifuge. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow, but she kept her eyes stubbornly locked on Toby, who was beginning to stir the dark veins on his neck, slowly receding as her serum entered his system. Suddenly, the heavy steel doors of the medical bay shuddered violently. A localized explosive charge detonated against the reinforced locks, blowing the doors off their hinges in a cloud of thick, acrid gray smoke. Dr. Pendleton and his nurses dropped to the floor, terrified. Through the smoke stepped 5 of Lord Preston's elite mercenaries, armed with silver-laced assault rifles. "Kill the brats. Leave no witnesses," the lead mercenary barked, raising his weapon toward the surgical tables. Before his finger could even brush the trigger, a blur of dark, monstrous motions slammed into him. Dominic Hayes didn't shift into his wolf form. He didn't need to. Operating on pure, unrestrained alpha speed, he tore through the mercenaries like a see-through wheat. He snapped the leader's neck with a sickening crunch, using the man's falling body as a shield against the incoming silver bullets. Gideon followed a second later, his tactical blade moving in a lethal, precise dance, dropping 2 more guards in the blink of an eye. But in the chaos, one mercenary slipped past the king. He vaulted over a medical cart, raising his sidearm directly at the unconscious Princess Mia. Mave didn't think. The maternal instinct that had kept the children alive in a freezing boiler room surged through her veins, overriding her physical exhaustion. With a feral, uncharacteristic scream, The tiny Omega ripped the intravenous line from her own arm, splattering blood across the pristine floor. She launched herself off the cot, tackling the heavily armored mercenary around the knees just as he fired. The shot went wild, shattering a glass cabinet of medical supplies. The mercenary cursed, kicking Mave violently in the ribs. She collapsed, gasping for air, but she immediately grabbed a discarded heavy oxygen tank from the floor and swung it upward with every ounce of strength she had left. The heavy metal cylinder smashed into the mercenary's kneecap, shattering the joint. As the man fell howling to the floor, Gideon stepped up and finished him with a swift strike to the temple. The room fell deadly silent, save for the erratic beeping of the heart monitors. Dominic stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing a brilliant, terrifying silver. He looked down at the broken bodies of the assassins, and then his gaze snapped to Mave. She was curled on the floor, bleeding from her arm and clutching her bruised ribs, but she was desperately trying to crawl back toward the pup's tables. Dominic crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her. He gently gathered her into his arms, his massive hands trembling as he assessed her injuries. The sheer, overwhelming wave of protective devotion that crashed over him was undeniable. In the lycanthrope world, a mate was recognized through scent and a sudden magical click of destiny. But as Dominic looked at the fierce, battered Omega, who had just fought an armed mercenary to protect his bloodline, he realized destiny had nothing to do with it. He had chosen her, and his wolf was roaring its absolute submission to her spirit. "You foolish, brave, beautiful creature," Dominic whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "I have you. You are safe." Mave looked up at him, her vision swimming, but she saw the silver of his eyes softening into a warm, luminous glow. "The pups," she breathed, "are curing." Pendleton's shaky voice called out from behind the surgical tables. The doctor slowly stood up, looking at the monitors in awe. "Your Majesty, it worked. The antibody has neutralized the wolf's bane. Their vitals are stabilizing. They are going to live." A tear slipped down Mave's cheek, mixing with the blood and soot on her face. She let out a long, shuddering breath, finally allowing her exhausted body to go limp in the Alpha King's arms. "Gideon, clear his throat," Dominic said softly, never taking his eyes off Mave. "Sire," Gideon stood at attention, wiping his blade. "Find Lord Alaric Preston upstairs." Dominic commanded, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by the cold, absolute certainty of a ruling monarch. "Bring him to the courtyard. Execute him publicly. Let the council know that treason against the crown will be paid in blood. At once, Your Majesty." Months later, the political landscape of the North American Lycanthrope Society was entirely unrecognizable. The Crescent Ridge Pack had been completely dismantled, its corrupt leaders imprisoned, and its wealth redistributed to the lower-ranking packs. The Lycan Council had been purged of Lord Preston's loyalists, replaced by individuals vetted personally by the king. But the most shocking change to the supernatural world was the woman who now sat on the royal throne beside Alpha King Dominic Hayes. The estate in Medina was bathed in the warm golden light of late spring. In the sprawling manicured gardens overlooking Lake Washington, the sounds of childish laughter echoed over the water. Prince Toby, Princess Mia, and Prince Leo, fully recovered, robust and radiating royal power, were chasing a silver-furred guard dog through the rose bushes. Watching them from the sweeping stone terrace was Queen Mave Hayes. She wore a simple, elegant silk dress that highlighted the subtle healing scars on her arms. Scars she refused to hide, wearing them as badges of her survival. Beside her stood Dominic, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, his thumb gently stroking her hip. The brutal, terrifying Alpha King was completely at peace, his aura a warm, protective blanket that enveloped his family. "They are getting faster." Dominic noted a rare, genuine smile touching his lips as Toby tackled the guard dog into a pile of leaves. "They are getting happier," Mave corrected softly, leaning her head against his broad shoulder. "That's what matters." Dominic turned to her, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. The intense, possessive love in his silver eyes still took her breath away. He leaned down, pressing a lingering, tender kiss to her lips, inhaling the scent of cedar and vanilla that had brought him back from the brink of vengeance. She was no longer the pariah of the basement. She was the heart of the kingdom. She was the Omega Queen, The woman who had shattered the ancient hierarchy, not with fangs or claws, but with an unconditional, fierce love that had brought the most powerful alpha in the world to his knees. In the end, the Crescent Ridge Pack's greatest mistake wasn't their financial greed or their treasonous alliances. It was their blind, arrogant adherence to a hierarchy that equated rank with worth. They looked at Mave Gallagher and saw only a disposable Omega, failing entirely to recognize the unyielding strength required to love fiercely in a world determined to break you. Her survival and the survival of the royal heirs proved that true power does not reside in the roar of an alpha or the sharpness of a claw. True power is the quiet, desperate courage of a mother protecting her shadows in the dark. By lifting the lowest among them to the highest seat of power, King Dominic Heirs didn't just save his family. He fundamentally fractured a broken system, proving that the heart of a wolf is measured by its loyalty, not its status.